What if the book you hold in your hands is not merely a record of what has been, nor a repetition of ancient decrees, but a living voice, a summons from the eternal, calling forth the heart to awaken? Hear me now, as I speak, not as one who instructs from afar, but as one whose consciousness reaches through the veils of time to touch the soul that listens. I have seen in the records of the Spirit that Hebrews was given to illuminate, to pierce the veils of tradition, and to turn the gaze of the faithful from what confines to what liberates. It is no ordinary epistle, nor a gentle reminder of law, but a clarion call to all who seek the truth beyond the stones and the scrolls. The words speak, and yet they live. They breathe, and yet they transcend the earthly. They are not bound by ink, but by the Spirit that moves through those who would hear. In my vision, I see a multitude of souls, poised between the weight of custom and the promise of the unseen, tempted to return to the old ways, to the laws engraved on tablets, to the sacrifices repeated year after year. Yet these practices cannot enter the heart, cannot illumine the soul. And I say to you, it is Christ who stands at the center, the fulcrum upon which the heavens turn, the one in whom all promises converge, the living revelation that eclipses all shadows of prophecy. Consider, my child, the prophets who spoke of God's will, the angels who carried his commands, the lawgiver who led his people from bondage. These were but preparatory. These were but foreshadowing. But Christ is the fulfillment, the living expression of the Father's intent, the brightness of the divine essence manifest in flesh, a presence that is both infinite and intimately near. I recall, in the visions of the Akashic records, how the early followers of the way were tempted. They beheld Moses and the mighty ones of Israel, they revered angels, and yet the Spirit whispered, "Do not place them above the one who embodies all, for Christ is not a mere messenger, he is the message itself. He is not bound to the ritual of stone and fire, but writes upon the heart the law that transforms, the covenant that renews, the promise that endures. Hear me, for the Spirit moves to awaken understanding. The law, though holy, is but a tutor. The sacrifices, though commanded, are but shadows. It is Christ who brings the substance. It is Christ who removes the veil. It is Christ who calls the soul to rise from the confines of fear, doubt, and hesitation. As I watch, I see the contours of time unfold, and I witness the hearts of men and women torn between the familiar comfort of tradition and the unsettling illumination of divine revelation. The words of Hebrews descend upon them like a voice of thunder in the wilderness, yet they are soft as a whisper to the willing ear. Behold, the days are come in which God speaks not only through prophets, but through his Son. Do you see it, my child? The audacity of this declaration, the tremor it sends through the chambers of the heart, the awakening it provokes in the depths of consciousness. I sense the tension, the awe, the trembling expectation, for it is not a letter of mere instruction, but a lifeline to those poised on the edge of drift. In this vision, I observe the Spirit's movement, and I speak to you as though the veil were lifted, that you may perceive what was hidden. The book of Hebrews begins with proclamation, not explanation, with power, not persuasion, with the assurance that the eternal is no longer distant, but has entered the human experience in fullness, in suffering, in glory, and in purpose. It is written to rouse, to awaken, to illuminate, and it speaks across the ages to you who read, to you who question, to you who long for understanding. The Spirit reminds me that in every age the message remains unchanged. Do not return to the shadows, behold the light. Fix your gaze upon the living revelation. I have felt the vibration of those ancient souls, the early Jewish Christians, standing at the crossroads of choice, facing persecution and temptation, and I have seen the guidance that flows from the pages of this epistle. It is a guidance that is both gentle and unwavering, a call to hold fast, a summons to discern, a beacon that pierces the fog of confusion. Do not drift, it whispers. Do not cling to what cannot transform you. The living word is here. It stands as anchor and guide, as mirror and light. It is not the shadow that will redeem, but the substance. Not the ritual that will save, but the one who fulfills all promises. I feel the weight of this truth pressing upon the soul, yet it is not heavy, it is liberating. To hear it is to awaken, to perceive it is to step into the current of divine purpose. And I, speaking as one who has glimpsed the infinite, tell you plainly, Hebrews is not a record of what was, but a revelation of what is. It does not confine the mind, it liberates the spirit. It does not demand fear, it invites trust. It does not call for mere obedience, it calls for alignment of heart, mind, and soul with the eternal. Thus I open my voice to you, not as distant teacher, but as guide whose consciousness reaches through time to awaken the heart to the wonder and the power contained within these words. The doorway has been set before you, and I urge you walk through it with the eyes of faith and the courage of understanding, for the book of Hebrews is no ordinary scripture. It is the voice of God calling you to the heart, to the spirit, and to life eternal. Let your heart be opened, for the vision unfolds before me, and I see the glory of the one who stands above all, beyond all earthly and celestial measure. In the epistle to the Hebrews, Christ is revealed not as mere messenger, not as prophet or angel, nor as the servant who delivers words written in stone, but as the living, breathing revelation of the divine, the exact imprint of God's essence, the radiance of eternal glory, manifest in flesh that feels, that suffers, and that redeems. I have perceived the depth of this truth, and I tell you that in every age, the human heart has been tempted to elevate the familiar Moses, the prophets, the angels, yet Christ is greater, and to know him is to perceive the infinite within reach of the finite. Imagine, if you will, the heavens themselves in awe, yet Christ enters our world, and the Creator walks among creation, not distant, not aloof, but intimately entwined with the frailty, the sorrow, and the temptation of humanity. The early followers, tempted to cling to the old ways, saw in Moses a tower of faith, in angels a brilliance that dazzled, in prophets a voice that instructed, yet they did not fully perceive the one who is above all. The Spirit whispered to me, "Behold, the Son, through whom all things were made, through whom the universe itself was formed, he is the message, and his presence surpasses all shadows that have gone before." Picture, my child, the wonder of this revelation, the very Word of God made flesh, the glory of the heavens incarnate, yet susceptible to hunger, to sorrow, to grief, to the piercing awareness of human suffering. Here lies the paradox that awakens the soul. Infinite power, enfleshed in tender vulnerability, divine majesty walking the dust of the earth. I have seen in the soul record the struggles of those first believers, torn between what they had known and what was being revealed. Angels may have heralded divine messages, but Christ is the message itself. Prophets may have spoken of God's will, but Christ embodies that will in action, in compassion, in the enduring gift of redemption. Moses led them out of bondage, but he did not bridge the chasm between humanity and God. He pointed forward, but could not fulfill. Christ fulfills, not in distant decree, but in living presence. I speak to you now with certainty. To behold him is to perceive the cosmos rearranged in the pattern of divine purpose, to see the law engraved not on tablets, but upon hearts. In this vision, I see the glory of Christ enthroned at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven, yet he bends to the lowliest place of need. Angels worship him. Moses bows, prophets testify, yet none surpass his radiance. And I tell you, it is in the recognition of this supremacy that the soul is awakened. For in knowing Christ above all, one sees the measure of human striving and its limitations, and one perceives the sufficiency of the divine. I felt, in the stillness of the Spirit, the trembling of those who heard these words in the first century, the awe mingled with fear, the heart lifted and yet pierced with realization that what they had clung to as the pinnacle of devotion was but a shadow of the realities standing before them. The author of Hebrews does not hesitate. There is no timid language, no gentle suggestion. Christ is described as the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, holding all things by the power of his word. Picture it, my child. The sun in all its brilliance, yet confined within it, is the reflection of the divine, as Christ carries the weight of the cosmos while entering fully into the human story. And in this I perceive the heartbeat of the epistle, a call not merely to belief, but to recognition, to alignment, to living in the reality of Christ's supremacy, tempted to elevate angels above the sun, to honor the prophets more than the living word. And yet the Spirit moves, saying, "Do not be deceived. The one who spoke the cosmos into being also knows the tear upon the cheek, the pang of grief, the yearning of the soul. The one who commands the stars also walks beside you in the shadows of fear. Fix your gaze upon him, for he is sufficient. He is the fullness of all that is holy and true." In this vision, I perceived how the mind grapples with magnitude and intimacy at once, the infinite and the approachable entwined. And I tell you, this is the gift of Hebrews. It awakens the understanding that the divine is not removed but revealed, not abstract but fully present. And I saw, my child, how Christ surpasses Moses in every measure of authority and purpose. Moses was faithful as a servant, but Christ is a son, heir of all things, the one through whom the universe itself was formed. Angels serve, but he reigns. Prophets speak, but he embodies the word. And yet, he chooses to enter the frailty of humanity, to know hunger, sorrow, rejection, temptation, suffering, and ultimately death itself. In this paradox lies the heart of divine love, the eternal entering the temporal, the infinite embracing the finite, the glory kneeling beside the humble. I urge you, hear these words as if they were breathed directly into your spirit. To see Christ above all is to release the old measures of devotion, to lift the heart beyond shadows, to awaken to the sufficiency of the one who fulfills all things. The glory of the heavens is contained in him, yet he bends to meet the soul. He is not merely above, he is within, beside, and for you. And as I perceived this, I felt the call to align the heart, to perceive the supreme reality, to recognize that the living word is not distant, not abstract, not bound by ritual, but fully present, supremely sufficient, and intimately near. Thus, I speak as one who has seen the record of the soul, as one whose consciousness spans the ages. Fix your gaze upon Christ, for he is above all, beyond all, and within all who seek. Let your understanding awaken. Let your heart be stirred. Let your soul rise. For in him, eternity and intimacy converge, and the fullness of the divine is revealed as never before. I speak to you now. Let your heart receive what I have seen in the records of the soul, for the vision unfolds of the one who bridges heaven and earth, the eternal high priest, the living intercessor who stands before the throne, not as a distant deity, but as the embodiment of mercy, understanding, and perfect obedience. In the epistle to the Hebrews, I perceive the author moving swiftly to place before the faithful the unparalleled nature of Christ's priesthood, not as a repetition of the earthly office, nor as a shadow of temporal sacrifice, but as the eternal, unshakable reality through which humanity may approach the divine. Picture, if you will, the high priest of ancient Israel, clothed in sacred garments, bearing the burden of the nation's sins, entering the Holy of Holies once a year, trembling with the weight of responsibility, his life intertwined with ritual and mortal limitation. Now, behold Christ, stepping into the sanctuary of heaven itself, entering not a man-made structure, but the very presence of God, offering a sacrifice not of bulls or goats, not of blood that must be renewed each year, but of his own life, once and for all, perfect and eternal, sufficient to cleanse the conscience, to reconcile the soul, and to restore the heart of humanity to fellowship with the Creator. I saw the astonishment upon the minds of those early believers, tempted to cling to the familiar rites, yet drawn forward by the revelation of a priest whose office transcended time, whose authority surpassed the heavens, whose love knew no limit. Christ, I perceived, is not only the high priest, but the perfect high priest, ordained forever in the order of Melchizedek, a priest without beginning or end, whose presence enfolds all creation and yet bends to the intimate sorrows of each human heart. He sympathizes with every weakness, yet is without sin. He faces every temptation, yet remains unblemished. He enters fully into our suffering, yet he is the embodiment of divine perfection. And in this, the faithful are offered a path not to mere forgiveness, but to communion, to participation in the eternal life of the Spirit. I tell you plainly, my child, as I have seen in the soul record, that the old sacrifices were instructive but insufficient. They symbolized the greater reality, pointed forward but could not transform. Christ's priesthood completes what was foreshadowed, abolishing the temporary and establishing access that is immediate, intimate, and enduring. Imagine the veil torn, the barriers removed, the pathway open, not through fear, not through ritual, not through human effort, but through the perfect offering of the Son, whose blood speaks a better word, whose intercession brings the mercy of God directly to the soul that approaches in faith. And I have felt the vibration of those early hearts, trembling with awe and wonder, realizing that the one who had created the stars, the seas, and the heavens had entered their world, had shared their mortality, had borne their temptation, and now intercedes for them in power that is beyond comprehension, yet near enough to touch every need. In this vision, I perceived the contrast sharply. Earthly priests, limited by mortality, bound by repetition, imperfect in their offerings, Christ, eternal, sufficient, compassionate, standing as the mediator between the finite and the infinite, offering not only pardon but transformation. The soul, I saw, is drawn to recognize that this priesthood is not merely office or function, but life itself, the very conduit of divine presence in the midst of human frailty. He is the anchor of hope, the assurance of mercy, the certainty of reconciliation. And I speak to you as one who has seen the spiritual currents. Do not approach him as distant. Do not revere him as abstract. Do not fear him as inaccessible, for he has entered the darkness of human experience, endured the weight of temptation, felt hunger, sorrow, rejection, and yet offered himself fully, perfectly, once and for all, to reconcile, redeem, and restore. This is the heart of Hebrews, my child. The revelation that Christ surpasses all earthly priests, all angels, all mediators, yet bends to enter the human experience, not to dominate, but to intercede, not to condemn, but to heal, not to demand, but to draw near. I have seen visions where the faithful, understanding this truth, are lifted from fear and ritual to courage and intimacy. The veil is removed not only from the temple in heaven, but from the human heart, allowing the spirit to flow, the conscience to be cleansed, the soul to stand unashamed before God. And yet, my child, this is not passive. The high priest calls for response. The gift is sufficient, but the heart must align. The intercession of Christ invites trust, invites surrender, invites recognition that the old ways, though holy, were incomplete, that the law carved on stone points to a reality that can only be fulfilled in the eternal priesthood of the Son. I have seen how this understanding transforms the soul. Fear is replaced with confidence, ritual with relationship, obligation with love, and the conscience is washed clean, free to serve, to worship, and to live within the flow of divine purpose. And I tell you further, my child, the high priest's office is not distant in time. It is present in every moment, for every soul who calls, who seeks, who opens the heart. His intercession is continuous, eternal, unbroken, touching the hidden struggles, the private battles, the unseen tears of every faithful heart. I have felt, as I witnessed the unfolding, the trembling of those who had relied upon the limitations of earthly priests, and their astonishment at the sufficiency, the intimacy, the perfection of Christ. The shadow has been removed. The reality has appeared. And in this, the soul is invited to trust, to rest, to engage, to approach the throne with confidence, knowing that the one who created all things has entered into the frailty of human existence to bring redemption, to reconcile, to restore, and to intercede continually, forever, in the order of Melchizedek. Thus I speak as one who has perceived the eternal currents, the heavenly patterns, the intercession that bridges the infinite and the finite. Fix your heart upon him, know the sufficiency of his priesthood, embrace the intimacy he offers, and recognize that through this eternal high priest, the soul finds access to God that is immediate, enduring, and transformative. The vision is clear, my child, the message unyielding. Christ is the eternal high priest, the perfect intercessor, the bridge between heaven and humanity, and all who approach him with faith find mercy, restoration, and the fullness of life eternal. As I open the vision of the Spirit before me, let your heart receive the truth that unfolds from the records of the soul, for I have seen that the old ways, though holy, were but shadows pointing toward what was to come, and the law engraved upon stone could not enter the chambers of the heart, could not transform the desires, could not lift the soul to intimacy with the divine. The sacrifices, though commanded by the Eternal, were temporal. They covered sin, yet left the conscience burdened. They offered purification, yet did not renew the spirit. And I tell you, as I have seen in the Akashic records, that Christ, the eternal high priest, entered fully into this human condition, offering the new covenant, a covenant not of external obedience, but of inner transformation, a covenant written not on tablets of stone, but on the living hearts of those who would receive him. In this revelation, I perceive the vastness of divine wisdom. The old law served to instruct, to guide, to illuminate the necessity of faith, yet it could not complete what was required, for the human heart hungered for a transformation that only the eternal Son could provide. And I say to you plainly, as I have felt in the vision, that the new covenant is a covenant of grace, of mercy, of liberation from the weight of guilt, of restoration from the chains that bound the soul in fear and ritual. I have witnessed the early believers clinging to what they had known, struggling with the transition from shadow to substance, from law to life, from ritual to relationship. They beheld the sacrifices of bulls and goats, the incense rising to the heavens, the veiled sanctuary that separated them from God. And yet they did not fully comprehend that all these things pointed forward to Christ, the perfect offering, once and for all, sufficient to cleanse the conscience, to reconcile the soul, to draw near to God with confidence, not fear. The Spirit impressed upon me the necessity of seeing beyond the temporal, of recognizing that the new covenant is not a modification of the old, but its fulfillment, not a repetition of ritual, but a living reality that transforms the very being of those who embrace it. I perceived the law of Moses as a tutor, guiding the children of Israel, yet incomplete, pointing to the greater, to the eternal, to the one who embodies the fullness of God's promise. As I speak now, I see the contrast vividly. Under the old covenant, access to the most holy place was limited, mediated by priests, contingent upon blood offered again and again. The people remained distant, separated from the divine presence, their hearts unrenewed, their conscience burdened. Yet under the new covenant the veil is torn, the pathway opened, and the soul may approach with boldness, confident in the perfect sacrifice of Christ, whose blood speaks a better word, whose intercession brings mercy and grace that endure forever. I saw the joy in the hearts of those who perceive this, yet also the trembling, for the magnitude of this reality cannot be contained in human understanding. The infinite entering the finite, the eternal bridging, the temporal, the divine meeting humanity in perfect love. And I speak plainly to you, my child, that the awakening occurs when the soul grasps this truth. The commandments of old are not abolished, but fulfilled. The shadow is replaced by the substance. The law written on stone is transformed into a law written on the heart, guiding, illuminating, empowering. I see the heart lifted from obligation to devotion, from fear to trust, from ritual to living faith. The new covenant is not a rule to follow, but a life to live, a relationship to embrace, a spirit to receive. I speak as one who has witnessed countless souls in this awakening, The one who receives the new covenant is called to trust, to surrender, to allow the divine to rewrite the desires, the motives, and the very inclinations of the heart. Consider, my child, how the early believers wrestled with this truth, tempted to cling to what was familiar, yet drawn forward by the promise of transformation. I saw visions of their hearts filled with awe and fear, seeing that Christ had become the substance of all that was anticipated. He fulfills the law, he embodies mercy, he offers intimacy with the eternal, and he empowers the faithful to live in alignment with the divine will. The Spirit impressed upon me the reality that the new covenant is both gift and responsibility. It offers freedom, yet calls for obedience of the heart. It offers access, yet invites alignment. It offers mercy, yet demands transformation. I perceived further, my child, that this covenant is not temporal, it is eternal. It does not cover sin for a season, it removes it for all time. It does not rely on the labor of humans, but on the perfect work of Christ, offered once and for all, sufficient to cleanse, to renew, to sanctify. I saw how the heart, when open to this truth, experiences a liberation that the old ways could not provide, confidence to approach God without fear, joy in the presence of mercy, and peace that transcends understanding. The soul rises from the weight of guilt, the burden of ritual, and the limitation of human effort, and enters into the fullness of relationship with the divine. And I speak to you, as I have seen in the vision, that the new covenant calls not merely for recognition, but for participation. The heart must respond, the soul must align, the life must bear witness to the reality within. It is not enough to know, one must live. It is not enough to see, one must obey. It is not enough to hear, one must trust. The law is fulfilled, the sacrifice accomplished, the pathway opened, and now the faithful are invited to enter into the fullness of life, eternal, guided by the Spirit, empowered by grace, transformed by love. Thus, my child, I speak as one who has perceived the eternal patterns, the divine currents, the unfolding of God's purpose through the new covenant. Let the heart awaken, let the soul rise, let the consciousness align with the eternal reality of Christ, who fulfills all things, who transforms all hearts, and who calls each to the living relationship that the shadows of the past could only point toward. The old covenant prepared, the new covenant perfects. The shadow recedes, the light is revealed. The law inscribed on stone is replaced by the law written on the heart, and the soul may stand unburdened, confident and alive in the presence of the eternal. The panorama of faith stretching across generations, and I tell you plainly, Hebrews 11 is not merely a record of names, it is a living testimony, a parade of witnesses who walked by trust in the unseen, who obeyed the call of the eternal when reason faltered, and whose courage echoes in the chambers of every seeking heart. Abraham, the father of nations, stands first, called to leave all that was familiar, to step into the unknown, to walk by faith into a land promised yet unseen, and I perceive the trembling in his spirit, the uncertainty that clutched at his mind, yet the unwavering alignment of his heart with the voice of the Almighty. He obeyed not because he understood all the details, but because he trusted the one who had called him. He left behind home, kin, and certainty, and in doing so became the exemplar of faith that bridges the generations, the first to respond fully to the living promise, his footsteps reverberating across time as a guide for all who would follow. And Moses, raised in the palace of Pharaoh, surrounded by privilege and comfort, yet his soul recognized the transient nature of earthly glory. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, counting it as loss in comparison to the calling of God. And I have perceived the struggle within him, the tension between ease and obedience, between temporal honor and eternal purpose. Yet he persevered, embracing the path of surrender, leading a people through the wilderness by trust in the unseen hand of God. He parted seas, endured trials, and kept the vision fixed upon the promise. And Rahab, the woman of Jericho, marked by past transgression, yet seeing the God of Israel through the eyes of faith, she welcomed the spies, risking her life for the obedience of her heart. And I tell you that her courage was not passive. It was active, deliberate, and transformative. For faith in action redeems. It does not merely justify, it alters destiny, shaping outcomes that the human mind cannot predict. And in her story, I perceived the principle that faith can elevate even the most unlikely, that the heart aligned with the divine may overturn circumstance, that obedience rooted in trust becomes a channel of grace. These are the giants whose lives speak beyond the page, whose faith was measured not by comfort or security, but by endurance, by surrender, and by courage to act in accordance with unseen promises. And the epistle reminds the soul that such faith is not blind optimism. It is confidence in what is hoped for, assurance in what is not seen, a steadfastness that aligns mind, will, and heart with the eternal. And I perceived that the weight of their choices resonates still, calling each reader, each seeker, to measure their own trust against the standard of the ancients, for the same Spirit that guided Abraham, Moses, and Rahab is at work in every willing soul, inviting, urging, compelling the heart to step beyond comfort, to move through uncertainty, to trust the unseen, to obey the call, and to embrace the path marked by perseverance. And I tell you, my child, the stories of these witnesses are not isolated. They are archetypes, patterns woven into the fabric of existence, reflections in the soul of the principles that govern the covenantal relationship between God and humanity. They remind us that faith is active. It requires movement. It is expressed in decision, in alignment, in the willingness to surrender personal understanding to divine direction. And I perceive that without such faith, even knowledge of law and ritual remains insufficient. The heart remains distant, the soul unanchored, the spirit unfulfilled. Yet with faith, the invisible becomes tangible, the promise becomes present, the unseen becomes guiding, and the ordinary life is transformed into a vessel of divine work. And I have seen countless moments when believers falter, when doubt clouds perception, when fear of consequence restrains action. Yet the examples of the ancients stand as testimony that obedience rooted in faith transcends circumstance, and that the alignment of the will with God's promise is sufficient to produce victory, deliverance, and transformation. And I speak now to the reader, to the seeker, to the one weighing the heart against the currents of doubt. Measure your courage against Abraham's, your surrender against Moses, your trust against Rahab's, for the principle remains unchanged. The spirit that empowered them moves still. The call to act in accordance with the unseen, to obey in the face of uncertainty, to trust beyond understanding, to persevere despite opposition, is as potent now as it was then. And the Epistle of Hebrews insists that faith is not a passive condition, but an active engagement, a bridge connecting the witnesses of the past with the disciples of the present. It is the thread that joins eternity with the temporal. It is the rhythm that carries the soul beyond hesitation into alignment with God's purpose. And I perceive that faith, exercised in trust and obedience, produces endurance, cultivat courage, shape destiny, and invites participation in the unfolding of God's plan. And the cumulative effect of these stories is to awaken the soul, to encourage perseverance, to illustrate the cost and the reward, to show that faith is tested, refined, and manifested in action. And I have observed that those who embrace these principles, who align with the pattern set by the ancients, find that their decisions ripple beyond themselves, influencing generations, transforming environments, and participating in the eternal narrative. And I tell you further, my child, that the principles embedded in the faith of Abraham, Moses, and Rahab are not confined to history. They are accessible. They are alive. They call to every heart that seeks, They instruct, they challenge, they invite, they awaken, and the call is unmistakable. Step forward, trust without seeing, obey beyond understanding, act with courage, and let the Spirit guide your choices. For in so doing, you participate in the same divine current that carried the faithful through trial, uncertainty, and the unknown, and your faith becomes testimony, your obedience becomes witness, your courage becomes example, and the living God is glorified in the life that aligns with his eternal purpose. Befalls the soul when attention falters, when the heart loosens its hold upon the eternal. And I tell you plainly that Hebrews warns not of sudden rebellion, but of subtle drift, a gradual surrender to the currents of distraction, doubt, and familiarity that appear harmless yet carry the soul into peril. The drift is neither immediate nor violent. It creeps upon the spirit with soft insistence, as water erodes stone, as wind bends the tallest tree until its roots are loosened, and I perceive the early believers, weary under persecution, tempted to return to the old ways, looking back upon the law and ritual with longing, forgetting the sufficiency of the sacrifice that had been offered. And I say to you, the danger remains the same today, for every soul is assailed by the currents of busyness, the distractions of the world, the allure of comfort over conviction, the temptation to settle into half measures of devotion, and yet the drift is deceptive. It seems insignificant at first, an overlooked compromise here, a neglected truth there, a subtle allowance of doubt, and the anchor that holds the soul to the eternal loosens until the spirit is carried into waters uncharted, perilous, and unstable. The drift is silent. It is invisible to the casual observer. It is nearly imperceptible to the mind that clings to routine. Yet I tell you, it is powerful, and without vigilance it can distance the heart from the presence of God, the rhythm of prayer, the alignment with spirit, the engagement with the truth that sustains. I have seen it in the records of those who faltered, their faith waning like a vessel untethered, tossed by currents they could not control. Their hearts hardened gradually, not by a single act of defiance, but by neglect, by distraction, by yielding to ease rather than enduring the challenge of obedience. And the warning is stark yet loving. See to it, my child, that your heart does not become hardened through subtle neglect. See to it that your conscience remains tender, that your spirit remains alert, that your devotion remains intentional. For the drift is not only a matter of the mind, it is the gradual loosening of the soul from its anchor in the divine. It is the slow erosion of trust, the fading of vigilance, the dimming of faith that once burned bright. And I perceive the imagery clearly, as though painted before my eyes. A ship untethered upon the sea, carried by currents it cannot see, waves rising around it, winds shifting unpredictably, the mariner confident in his vessel, yet unaware that the anchor has slipped. And I tell you, this is the condition of the soul that allows drift, confident in habit, but unaware of spiritual vulnerability, moving along familiar waters, yet unaware of the hidden rocks beneath, the storms that lie ahead, the peril that threatens without warning. And Hebrews calls for awareness, for vigilance, for intentional anchoring, for constant attention to the Word of God, for engagement with the Spirit that sustains and guides. The Word is a compass cutting through confusion, revealing deception, pointing the soul back to what is eternal, reminding the heart that faith is active, that devotion requires mindfulness, that spiritual life is a race demanding focus, perseverance, and alignment with the one who holds all things. And I perceive that the early believers were exhorted to encourage one another daily, to speak truth, to remind each other of the sufficiency of the sacrifice, to bear witness to hope, to strengthen the weak. For drift is countered not merely by effort alone, but by the presence of community, by the living word, by mutual engagement in the pursuit of the eternal. And I tell you, my child, these principles apply as much now as then, for every soul faces the subtle pull away from alignment with God, from the recognition of Christ as anchor, from the practice of faith that sustains under trial, the drift is silent yet relentless. It enters the heart in moments of fatigue, distraction, uncertainty, doubt, and the cure is vigilance, conscious engagement, responsiveness to the Spirit, deliberate holding fast to what has been heard, deliberate attention to the promises, deliberate alignment with the example of Christ, who endured temptation, who faced suffering, who remained steadfast, and I perceive the imagery once more, the anchor, firm, unmovable, held in place by the one who never falters, yet the soul must cling, must secure itself, must remain attentive, must resist the subtle pull of convenience, habit, and neglect, and the drift is overcome when the heart chooses to respond, when the mind focuses upon the eternal, when the soul engages with vigilance, when faith is exercised in action, and Hebrews provides the example, the admonition, the encouragement, showing that drift is not inevitable, that the currents of distraction may be resisted, that the storms of uncertainty may be navigated, that the anchor may hold firm if the soul engages with consciousness, intention, and trust. And I tell you further, the danger of drift is magnified when the voice of the eternal is ignored, when the promptings of the Spirit are neglected, when the guidance of community is disregarded, when the lessons of the past are forgotten, for in these conditions the vessel drifts and the soul may find itself in peril. Yet Hebrews offers hope, offering the anchor of the Word, the sufficiency of Christ, the presence of the Spirit, the guidance of the faithful, and I perceive that this combination is sufficient to steady, to protect, to restore, to reclaim, and I speak as one who has seen the records of drifting souls, their peril, their recovery, their alignment, and the principle is eternal. Vigilance, intentionality, engagement, reliance upon the eternal anchor, adherence to the Word, encouragement of one another, awareness of subtle drift, and commitment to faith are the lifelines that preserve the soul in times of peril. And I tell you, my child, that to neglect this is to invite instability, yet to embrace it is to walk with confidence, assurance, and peace, navigating the currents of life with the unshakable presence of Christ as anchor, guiding the vessel safely through storms, waves, and the unseen dangers of the spiritual seas. The tabernacle revealed not as mere stone and gold, nor as ritual confined to the hands of men, but as a shadow of the eternal sanctuary, a mirror of the heavenly reality, where Christ ministers for the souls of humanity. And I tell you plainly that every element, every detail, every measurement of the earthly tabernacle pointed forward to him, the lampstands, the altar of incense, the veil that separated, the most holy place, all were but symbols, shadows, placeholders for the substance that has come. And I perceive the high priest of old entering the veil once a year, trembling, bearing the blood of bulls and goats, seeking reconciliation for the people, yet knowing that the access was limited, temporary, imperfect. And I saw the contrast revealed by Hebrews. Christ entered once for all, not into a building made with human hands, but into the very presence of God, offering a sacrifice perfect, eternal, sufficient to cleanse the conscience and restore the heart. And I tell you that in this reality, the veil is no longer an obstruction, for it has been torn, and the soul may approach with boldness, with confidence, with assurance, grounded in the perfect work of the eternal high priest. And I perceive the symbolism alive, vivid, reaching through time, showing that the earthly tabernacle was instructive, preparatory, but never complete, for the Spirit revealed that the true sanctuary is beyond stone, beyond ritual, beyond human repetition. It is the eternal presence of God in Christ. And I saw how the blood of Christ, untainted, unspoiled, offered once for all, surpasses every temporary sacrifice, purifying not outwardly alone, but cleansing the conscience, the inner being, the very inclination of the heart. And I perceived that the early believers struggling with the weight of law and ritual, were called to awaken to this truth, to understand that the shadows have given way to the substance, that the copy has been replaced by the reality, that the pattern fulfilled in heaven is now operative for the soul that receives Christ in faith. And I tell you further, my child, that the tabernacle points to more than access. It points to intimacy, to participation, to the privilege of standing in the presence of the eternal, not by human merit, not by repeated sacrifice, but by the once-for-all offering of the Son. And I saw the vessels, the lamps, the incense, and the altar become living symbols in the consciousness of the believer, teaching that holiness, devotion, and worship are not confined to a building or ritual, but may now be expressed in every heart aligned with the divine, in every act of obedience, in every offering of love, in every thought consecrated to the eternal. And I perceived how the heavenly tabernacle, unseen yet real, now receives the worship of those whose hearts are open, whose faith is active, whose lives are living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. And I tell you plainly that the earthly tabernacle was temporary. It was a shadow. It was instructive. But it could not confer permanence. It could not cleanse the conscience fully. It could not bridge the eternal chasm. Yet the reality in Christ does all. And I saw the believer, standing in understanding, lifted from the limitations of ritual, entering the eternal sanctuary in spirit, experiencing access that the priests of old could only anticipate. And I perceive that the veil torn signifies not only forgiveness, but transformation, that the heart may now be engaged fully, the soul may now respond intimately, the spirit may now dwell freely, and worship becomes a living, continuous expression, no longer bound by time or structure, but eternal in intent and effect. And I tell you that the tabernacle, both earthly and heavenly, communicates this principle. The presence of God, mediated through Christ, is sufficient, complete, transformative, and the soul must recognize the shift from symbol to substance, from shadow to reality, from ritual to relationship. And I saw the offerings of old, the lambs, the bulls, the incense, the sacrifices, reinterpreted in the light of the eternal reality, each pointing to the once-for-all work of Christ, each teaching the soul the necessity of the living presence. And I tell you further, that those who linger in the shadow, who cling to ritual without recognition of the substance, who fail to embrace the reality, revealed, remain distant, burdened, limited. Yet those who perceive and accept the eternal tabernacle, who enter by faith, who respond with heart aligned, experience liberty, access, intimacy, and the transformation of the conscience. And I perceive the imagery vividly. The high priest of old, the most holy place, the veil, the blood, the incense, the lampstands, all reflected in the mind of the believer, yet now alive in spirit, accessible to those whose faith reaches beyond the temporal, beyond the seen, beyond the ritual, into the eternal presence where Christ ministers, where mercy flows, where the conscience is purified, where access is granted, and where the soul may abide in the reality of the divine. And I tell you, my child, that this revelation is not abstract. It is practical, it is personal, it is transformative. It calls the heart to recognize that worship, obedience, devotion, and service are no longer confined to ritual, but may now be lived in spirit, in alignment with the eternal sanctuary, in participation with the eternal high priest. And I perceived that the tabernacle, as taught in Hebrews, is a blueprint, a living pattern, a revelation that bridges heaven and earth, instructs the soul, awakens understanding, and calls for active response. And I speak now to the heart of every reader. Do not cling to shadows. Do not limit your devotion to what is seen. Do not neglect the reality that has come, but embrace the substance, enter the eternal sanctuary in spirit. Participate in the living presence of Christ. Let your conscience be cleansed, your heart transformed, your life consecrated, your worship eternal. and your soul aligned with the purpose of the divine, for the tabernacle, though once earthly and limited, now lives in spirit, fulfilled in Christ, accessible to the faithful, and active in every life that seeks, obeys, and trusts the eternal. The condition of souls who linger in spiritual infancy, who partake only of the milk of the Word, who remain content with the elementary truths. And I tell you plainly, Hebrews calls the faithful to move beyond this state, to embrace solid food, to exercise discernment, to cultivate understanding, and to train themselves in righteousness, for maturity is not granted automatically. It is earned through intentional engagement, through perseverance, through alignment of heart, mind, and soul with the eternal. And I perceive the imagery clearly. The infant receives milk, sustenance for life, yet insufficient for full growth, while the mature partakes of meat, nourishing strength, developing faculties, producing fruit, and the epistle exhorts the believer to advance, to stretch beyond what is comfortable, to wrestle with the deeper truths, to move from passive reception to active discernment, to distinguish good from evil, to exercise judgment guided by the Spirit. For in the cultivation of these faculties, the soul is strengthened, the conscience is refined, and the heart is aligned with the divine purpose. And I tell you further, my child, that training requires perseverance, for the flesh is weak, the world is enticing, and distractions abound. Yet those who persist, who wrestle with the Word, who apply its principles to every circumstance, who allow the Spirit to guide their understanding, grow in capacity, bear fruit useful to the household of God. And I saw vividly how the land that drinks in the rain produces grain to sustain, while land that produces thorns and thistles yields no harvest and is exposed to judgment. And I tell you that the parallel is precise. The soul that receives, meditates, applies, and exercises discernment becomes fertile, productive, and alive, while the soul that neglects, that remains stagnant, that rejects training becomes barren, choked with distraction, and endangered by spiritual decay. And I perceive the role of discipline not as punishment, but as cultivation, as the hand of the divine gardener shaping the inner being, pruning what hinders growth, nurturing what sustains, teaching the soul to respond, to obey, to persevere. And I saw the necessity of intentionality, for growth does not occur by accident, nor by mere exposure to truth, but by conscious engagement, by repeated exercise, by active application. And Hebrews warns that those who fail to progress remain in infancy, vulnerable to deception, limited in capacity, unable to bear the fruit that the Spirit intends. And I tell you that the mature believer distinguishes truth from error, right from wrong, mercy from compromise, obedience from convenience, and the training of the soul develops faculties that perceive the subtleties of life, the hidden dangers, and the paths that align with the eternal. And I perceived that this training encompasses both understanding and practice. Comprehension without application produces nothing. Practice without discernment leads astray. Both must be integrated, harmonized, exercised daily. And I saw the faithful challenged to examine themselves continually, to test motives, to correct deviations, to embrace correction, to persevere despite trial. For the pattern of maturity is not passive, it is active. And those who heed the call become vessels of righteousness, agents of mercy, instruments of the Spirit. And I tell you plainly, my child, that the epistle exhorts the believer to move from the elementary teachings of Christ to deeper understanding, to engage in constant refinement, to exercise faith that is deliberate, informed, and active, for maturity is measured not merely by knowledge, but by the fruit of love, obedience, and steadfastness. And I perceived vividly the consequences of neglect. The soul, stagnant in milk, fails to develop strength, fails to withstand temptation. fails to produce the harvest intended, while the soul that labors perseveres and applies the word thrives, endures, and flourishes in alignment with divine purpose. And I tell you further that Hebrews uses imagery of the land, the seed, and the harvest to illustrate the principle. Just as soil that receives rain produces fruit, so the soul that receives the Spirit applies the word, exercises discernment, and perseveres under trial, produces righteousness, endurance, and blessing. And I perceived that training also encompasses endurance in suffering, restraint in temptation, courage in adversity, patience in delay, and diligence in service. For the mature soul integrates understanding with action, belief with obedience, and principle with practice. And I tell you plainly, my child, that growth is not instantaneous, nor is it guaranteed. It requires engagement, deliberate choice, conscious effort, and reliance upon the Spirit. And Hebrews warns that neglect of growth endangers the soul, leaving it vulnerable to deception, drifting, or falling away. Yet those who embrace maturity are strengthened, fortified, and established, capable of discerning the subtleties of life, resisting temptation, guiding others, and participating fully in the work of the eternal. And I perceive that the faithful are exhorted to examine themselves continually, to measure their progress, to identify weaknesses, to cultivate strengths, to persevere in training, and to align every thought, word, and action with the principles of righteousness. For maturity encompasses not only knowledge, but application, not only understanding, but transformation, not only reception, but engagement. And I tell you that the soul advanced in maturity becomes a living witness, a vessel of blessing, a participant in the eternal plan, producing fruit that endures beyond time, influencing generations, and reflecting the presence of the Spirit in every act. And I perceive that the training of the soul is a lifelong endeavor, requiring vigilance, discipline, reflection, and active obedience. And Hebrews calls for commitment to this path, for those who neglect it risk barrenness, stagnation, and vulnerability, while those who embrace it enter into abundance, resilience, and alignment with the eternal. And I tell you further, my child, that the journey to maturity is marked by perseverance, guided by discernment, strengthened by the Spirit, illuminated by the Word, and expressed in action, obedience, and steadfastness. And those who endure in training, who wrestle with truth, who apply understanding, who engage in deliberate practice, become capable of navigating temptation, adversity, and challenge, producing fruit that glorifies the eternal, benefits the household of God, and advances the work of righteousness. And I perceive that the epistle exhorts each believer to move continually from milk to solid food, from infancy to maturity, from passive reception to active engagement, from limited understanding to full participation. And I tell you plainly that maturity is the evidence of faith exercised, the manifestation of love obedient, the reflection of divine purpose realized, and the soul that attains it stands firm, prepared, fruitful, and aligned with the eternal plan, reflecting the glory of the Spirit in thought, word, and deed. The discipline of God is not punishment, it is cultivation. It is the loving hand of the Father preparing the soul for holiness. It is the fire that purifies, the hammer that reveals what is hidden, the sculptor who chisels away what obstructs. And I perceive the heart trembling under correction, feeling pressure, experiencing discomfort. Yet this very weight is a sign of legitimacy. For what son or daughter is unrefined by the hand of the Father is not fully recognized, and Hebrews instructs clearly that hardship is an instrument of love, a call to endurance, a shaping of the Spirit that produces peace and righteousness. And I have seen those who resist, who recoil from correction, who ignore the refining process, and their souls stagnate, bearing fruit unfit for the kingdom. Yet those who submit, who embrace the discipline with understanding, are strengthened, elevated and made ready for the inheritance promised, and I tell you that the principle is eternal. Pain endured under the guidance of divine discipline produces character, fortitude, and capacity for holiness, whereas neglect leads to weakness, instability, and spiritual vulnerability. And I perceive the imagery vividly, as though painted before my eyes, a father teaching a child to walk, allowing the stumble, guiding the step, correcting with firmness, yet full of love, the bruises temporary, the lesson enduring. And I tell you that in the life of the believer, the Lord employs the same method, allowing trials, permitting correction, presenting circumstances that stretch, refine, and purify. And these experiences are not accidental, they are intentional, designed to draw the heart closer to obedience, to align the will with the eternal, to produce perseverance, endurance, and discernment. And Hebrews declares that no discipline seems pleasant at the time, yet later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. And I have seen in the records how suffering, loss, waiting, correction, and struggle operate as instruments in the divine workshop, transforming character, revealing priorities, strengthening resolve, and deepening faith. And I tell you plainly, my child, that holiness is the goal, not comfort, not ease, not fleeting pleasure, for the eternal desires a people set apart, reflecting his nature, shining light into darkness. And I perceive that endurance under discipline connects the believer with the cloud of witnesses, those who persevered through trials, suffering, and hardship, whose stories serve as testimony, encouragement, and guide. And Hebrews calls the soul to fix its gaze upon Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith, who endured the cross, scorned its shame, and now sits at the right hand of the throne of God, demonstrating the ultimate model of obedience, endurance, and holiness. And I tell you further, my child, that the process of divine discipline is not arbitrary. It is proportional, purposeful, and aimed at restoration. It reveals the hidden tendencies, exposes pride, removes what is harmful, and cultivates what is eternal. And I perceive that the believer must not resist, must not harden the heart, must not flee from the refining fire, for to do so is to forfeit the fullness of growth, yet to embrace it with trust is to participate in the formation of the soul into a vessel pleasing to the Creator, capable of bearing fruit that endures, influencing others, and reflecting divine nature. And I tell you that the imagery of Hebrews is powerful. The hammer, the fire, the chisel, the pruning, each representing an aspect of divine correction, each shaping the soul, each calling to respond with humility, obedience, and trust. And I perceive the internal struggle within every believer, the tension between resistance and surrender, between fear and trust, between self-will and submission, yet the principle remains unchanged. Discipline is love, refinement is mercy, and holiness is the fruit of enduring the shaping process. And I tell you that the goal is not mere endurance, but transformation, not survival, but maturity, not avoidance of discomfort, but engagement with the refining work. And I perceive that the faithful who embrace discipline find that trials become teachers, suffering becomes instructive, correction becomes guidance, and every encounter with challenge produces insight, endurance, and alignment with the eternal will. And Hebrews exhorts the soul to strengthen feeble arms, to make level paths for the feet, to prepare for obstacles, to navigate life with eyes fixed upon the eternal. And I tell you that the hand of God is present in every circumstance, every difficulty, every trial, guiding the believer through refinement, revealing the pathway to holiness, and preparing the soul for the inheritance of the kingdom. And I perceive that Jesus serves as both example and anchor, having endured suffering not for himself, but for humanity, demonstrating the pattern of discipline embraced in love, obedience, and faith, And I tell you that the believer, engaging with divine correction, participates in the same process, entering the work of refining the heart, strengthening the will, cultivating character, and deepening faith. And Hebrews emphasizes that the outcome of discipline is the harvest of righteousness, the peace of mind, the alignment of heart and will with the eternal, the ability to withstand temptation, navigate trial, and engage in the works of the kingdom. And I perceive that without embracing this process, the soul drifts, weak and unstable, yet with engagement, perseverance, and trust. The believer stands firm, fruitful, and aligned with divine purpose, reflecting the character of God in thought, word, and deed. And I tell you plainly, my child, that discipline is the instrument of growth. Holiness is the fruit of endurance, and the soul that submits to the refining work of the eternal emerges prepared, steadfast, and established, capable of enduring all trials, participating in the divine plan, and bearing fruit pleasing to the Creator. And I perceive that this principle transcends time, applying to all who seek alignment with the eternal, and Hebrews instructs without ambiguity: embrace discipline, endure correction, pursue holiness, and the Spirit will perfect the soul, producing character, perseverance, and eternal fruit that endures beyond time, circumstance, and trial. I have seen, my child, the fullness of the record, the weaving of truth, the alignment of the heart with the eternal, and I tell you plainly that what remains after all instruction, all vision, all revelation is not knowledge alone, but the crystallization of understanding, a quiet recognition that the Spirit has moved, that the heart has been touched, that the soul perceives its place within the eternal design, and I see the pattern of all that has been revealed. Christ above all, the eternal high priest, the new covenant inscribed upon the heart, the faith of the ancients, the vigilance against drift, the reality of the heavenly tabernacle, the necessity of maturity, and the refining work of discipline. And in this vision, I perceive their convergence into a single truth. The divine presence is sufficient, intimate, transforming, and unshakable, and the soul, when aligned with this reality, rests not in fear, nor in ritual, nor in fleeting understanding, but in the certainty of being known, sustained, and guided. And I tell you that the richness of Hebrews is not merely in its words, nor in its historical setting, nor in its doctrinal exposition, but in the awakening it produces within the consciousness of the reader, the stirring of the heart toward engagement, the recognition of the sufficiency of Christ, and the invitation to participate fully in the eternal flow of grace, mercy, and truth. And I perceive that the soul, when it receives this revelation, experiences a depth of clarity that transcends comprehension, a serenity that surpasses turmoil, a confidence that no storm can overturn, for the anchor has been set, the pathway illuminated, the presence secured, and the Spirit active within, guiding, sustaining, and transforming. And I tell you further, my child, that understanding is not the end, but the threshold, the entry point into living alignment. For the soul that perceives must act, that recognizes must respond, that understands must engage, and the crystallization of knowledge becomes the catalyst for obedience, devotion, worship, and holiness. And I have seen how this awareness changes perception, transforms decision, and reorients the heart toward eternal priorities, lifting the gaze above temporary circumstance, revealing the eternal within the temporal, the infinite within the finite, and the divine presence within the human experience. And I tell you that the crystallization of understanding brings a quiet, persistent reminder that nothing outside Christ can truly anchor the soul, that all worldly structures, achievements, relationships, and comforts are fleeting, and only alignment with the eternal reality endures, secures, and satisfies. And I perceive how the faithful, reflecting on this truth, begin to see life itself differently. The trials become instructive, the losses become perspective, the joys become sacred, the ordinary acts become expressions of devotion. and the heart learns to dwell continuously in the awareness of the eternal, sustained by presence, guided by spirit, and anchored in the sufficiency of Christ. And I tell you, my child, that this awareness does not arrive suddenly, nor as a result of mere intellect, but as the culmination of perception, reflection, obedience, and engagement, the soul shaped through experience, refined through trial, guided through scripture, illuminated by vision, and awakened to its divine identity and eternal purpose. And I have seen the enduring effect of this crystallization. The soul moves with quiet confidence, acts with deliberate righteousness, perseveres through trial, engages with the world yet remains unshaken, sees the eternal in all things, and bears witness to the transformative presence of the divine. And I tell you further that the final perception is not passive. It resonates within every choice, every action, every thought, aligning the believer with the ongoing work of the eternal, producing fruit that is eternal, influence that is enduring, and devotion that is living, active, and visible in the world. And I perceive the lasting image, a soul, aware, anchored, aligned, radiant with the Spirit, reflecting the light of Christ in the midst of shadow, embodying mercy, engaging in holiness, persevering in faith, sustaining hope, and living fully within the eternal covenant. And I tell you plainly, my child, that this is the conclusion of the vision, the crystallization of understanding, the deep awareness that the journey is not merely historical, theoretical, or distant, but immediate, intimate, and transformative. And the heart, having perceived, having aligned, having engaged, rests in the enduring truth. Christ is sufficient, the Spirit is present, the covenant is fulfilled, and the soul, anchored in this awareness, participates in the eternal plan, lives in the eternal reality, and reflects in every moment the love, the mercy, the wisdom, and the power of the divine. And I perceive in the deepest current of the soul a quiet echo, a resonance that endures beyond words, beyond circumstance, beyond understanding, a persistent reminder that all that has been revealed leads to the same conclusion. Align, obey, trust, persevere, love, and the eternal will guide, sustain, and perfect. And the soul, resting in this crystallized awareness, enters into peace, confidence, and the enduring presence of God, fully engaged, fully alive, and fully aligned with the eternal purpose of the divine.